Somewhere out there, sitting untouched since 2010, is a fortune worth roughly $100 billion. Whoever controls it would rank among the 11 richest people alive. They could buy companies, influence governments, retire every relative they've ever had. And they have done absolutely nothing with it for over 15 years. The person who created Bitcoin walked away from all of it on purpose. And the reason they left might be more important to understanding Bitcoin than anything written in the actual code. This is the story of Satoshi Nakamoto, the most famous anonymous person in financial history, and the very specific, very deliberate moment that pushed them to vanish. The last thing that set it off. By December 2010, Bitcoin had been quietly running for about 2 years. Small, niche, mostly ignored by the wider world. A single Bitcoin was trading for somewhere between 20 and 30 cents. Then WikiLeaks happened. WikiLeaks had been trying to collect donations, but major payment processors like PayPal refused to work with the platform because of how controversial it had become. A tech journalist noticed something interesting. Bitcoin, this obscure digital currency nobody outside a small forum had heard of, could theoretically work as a PayPal alternative for an organization the entire financial establishment had just frozen out. The article was straightforward and factual. It never advocated for WikiLeaks politically. It simply made the connection. That was enough. One day after the article went live, Satoshi reacted by posting what would become their final public comment ever, writing, "It would have been nice to get this attention in any other context. WikiLeaks has kicked the hornet's nest, and the swarm is headed towards us." Then nothing. After that single sentence, Satoshi disappeared from the internet entirely, leaving behind nothing but the project itself. Why a few sentences mattered so much. Think about what Satoshi was actually afraid of in that moment. Not regulators reading a white paper, not some abstract legal risk sitting out there in theory. A real, specific, sudden spotlight, the kind that comes from being publicly linked to one of the most controversial organizations in the world, at a moment when governments were actively hunting for ways to choke WikiLeaks off financially. If Bitcoin became known as the currency that helps WikiLeaks survive, it wasn't going to be treated as a quirky cryptography project anymore. It was going to be treated as a target. And whoever was sitting behind the Satoshi Nakamoto name had every reason to believe that Target might eventually have their real name attached to it. This wasn't paranoia pulled from nowhere. Bitcoin had launched with a pointed message embedded directly into its very first block, a headline referencing a bank bailout, a permanent piece of commentary aimed squarely at the traditional financial system Satoshi was trying to challenge. This was someone who built an entire currency as a deliberate alternative to the banks and governments controlling money. Suddenly becoming the public face of the WikiLeaks currency was about as fast a way as possible to convert the quiet ideological project into the kind of story that gets a knock on your actual front door. This wasn't a sudden decision. Here's what makes this less of a panic and more of a calculated exit. Satoshi had already been preparing Bitcoin to survive without them months before the WikiLeaks moment ever happened. Nakamoto made all modifications to Bitcoin's source code personally until mid-2010, at which point control of the source code repository and the network alert key was handed over to Gavin Anderson. Several other critical domains and resources were also transferred to prominent members of the growing Bitcoin community around the same time. This is a strange thing to do if you're simply losing interest in a side project. It's exactly what you do if you already knew, well in advance, that you eventually planned to vanish and wanted to make absolutely sure the thing you built didn't vanish along with you. By the later months of 2010, tensions had already been building inside the community. Frustration with Satoshi's limited availability and authority had grown loud enough that some users had started openly referring to Satoshi as the bottleneck, or even the dictator of the project. Whether or not Satoshi consciously connected those two pressures, the growing demand for a more decentralized structure and the sudden WikiLeaks exposure, the timing lines up almost perfectly. The community wanted Satoshi to matter less. The WikiLeaks moment gave Satoshi a clean, justified reason to make that happen immediately. The quiet goodbye. Satoshi's last post on the Bitcoin Talk forum came on December 12, 2010. A few private messages trickled out after that, mostly about technical matters, growing more and more sparse. Then, on April 23, 2011, one final email arrived for Bitcoin developer Mike Hearn. It read, "I've moved on to other things. It's in good hands with Gavin and everyone." That's it. No grand farewell, no explanation of who they were or why they'd built any of it, no farewell speech at all. Just a short, almost bureaucratic handoff, like someone leaving a job and updating their out-of-office message on the way out. Why disappearing might have been the smartest move Bitcoin ever made. Here's the part that turns this from a simple story about someone fleeing risk into something much more interesting. The disappearance didn't just protect Satoshi. It may have been the single most important thing that made Bitcoin actually work as designed. Bitcoin's entire pitch was decentralization. A currency with no central authority, no single point of control, no government or company that could shut it down by pressuring one person. Satoshi's absence ensured Bitcoin wasn't controlled by any single leader, and instead, the project has been maintained ever since by an open source community with no single point of failure. If Satoshi had stuck around as a known public figurehead, Bitcoin would have inherited an obvious weakness. Pressure one person, and you pressure the entire currency. Subpoena Satoshi. Arrest Satoshi. Regulate Satoshi out of existence. Every one of those becomes a real strategy the moment there's an actual named human standing behind the project. Bitcoin was supposed to be decentralized, and Satoshi's retreat may have been entirely purposeful. Specifically so, the currency wouldn't end up resting on a single figure. Without a clear leader, Bitcoin evolved into a worldwide protocol instead of a branded product tied to one person's reputation or legal exposure. In other words, the disappearance wasn't just self-preservation. It was, quite possibly, the final and most important design decision Satoshi ever made for Bitcoin, proving the currency could survive, govern itself, and keep growing with absolutely nobody steering it. The fortune nobody has touched. Here's the detail that makes this whole story even stranger. Satoshi is estimated to hold somewhere between 750,000 and 1,100,000 Bitcoin, almost certainly mined in Bitcoin's earliest days when almost nobody else was even participating. At recent valuations, that stash would be worth somewhere in the neighborhood of 99 billion, and it has not moved, not once. Blockchain data confirms that the very first coins Satoshi ever mined haven't moved in over a decade, sitting completely untouched through every single price swing Bitcoin has gone through since. Think about the discipline, or perhaps just the irrelevance of money required to do that. Someone holding tens of billions of dollars in value, watching Bitcoin's price rise and crash and rise again for 15 plus years, and never once cashing out. Nobody knows for certain whether the keys were lost, whether there's a deliberate choice not to touch them, or whether Satoshi is simply gone in some more permanent sense. That fortune, sitting frozen in place, has become its own strange kind of trust mechanism for Bitcoin. Some in the community regard Satoshi's disappearance, untouched fortune included, as one of the best things that's ever happened to the project, while others remain genuinely concerned about what might happen to Bitcoin's price and psychology if those dormant coins were ever suddenly spent. The silence isn't just mysterious, it's load-bearing. An entire layer of trust in Bitcoin rests partly on the assumption that the person who could move markets with a single transaction has chosen, for 15 years straight, not to. The identity hunt that never ends. Naturally, the mystery has fueled an enormous ongoing hunt for who Satoshi actually is. Various cryptography experts, including Adam Back, Hal Finney, and Nick Szabo, have been floated as candidates over the years, sometimes individually and sometimes as part of a theorized group effort rather than a single person. A 2014 Newsweek investigation infamously identified a California man literally named Satoshi Nakamoto as the creator, a conclusion that drew widespread criticism and was never convincingly proven. None of these theories have ever been confirmed with certainty, and in a way that's exactly the outcome the original disappearance was built to produce. A creator who vanishes cleanly enough doesn't just protect themselves. They make their own currency genuinely unkillable by removing the one vulnerability every other system has: a person you can find. The real takeaway: Satoshi Nakamoto didn't disappear because they got bored or lost interest. The timeline tells a much sharper story. A sudden, very real spike in danger tied to WikiLeaks, a project already being quietly prepared to function without its creator, and a final short message handing the keys to the community before going completely silent. What's left behind isn't just a mystery. It's arguably the most successful piece of design in Bitcoin's entire history, a currency that proved it could survive, scale, and thrive for over 15 years with absolutely no one in charge, no headquarters to raid, and no founder left to pressure. The Vanishing Act wasn't a flaw in the story of Bitcoin. For better or worse, it might be the exact reason the story kept going at all.